Hey, this is Mike Houtzager and of Premium Crickets, Robert Johnson, and Hoover. This segment we're going to talk about worms. We have a lot of different worms on the website. Some are appropriate, some may not be appropriate for bearded dragons. And let's just kind of go through the different types of worms we have and where they play a role and where they don't. I think the basic one, let's just start with the medium mealworm. That's the small one. You see that on the website. It's a fairly small mealworm. What do you like about medium mealworms? What do you don't like about medium mealworms?
It gives them a variety of different foods to eat. I wouldn't use the mealworm for a staple diet.
What's missing in it?
Nutrition, basically.
Yeah.
There's a lot of exoskeleton in a mealworm versus what nutrients he has in his body.
Right. So you're saying a mealworm is a little harder to digest?
Right.
Okay.
Right. You can start your babies off, say, around 6 weeks eating mealworms, and it gives them kind of a variety. You don't want to eat steak every night, steak and potatoes every night. They're just like us. And sometimes they will actually quit eating a food source if that's all they get. They'll just say no more. We've had dragons just stop eating a certain food source.
Okay.
Mealworms is a good variety. It's something that I wouldn't use for a staple, as I would crickets. Or superworms are the same way. I wouldn't use superworms. Would be kind of like a treat you would get 2 or 3 times a week. Using crickets as a staple is basically what we do, where we breed these guys.
Okay. So it's something you add to as a supplement to their diet. Okay, so we talked about mealworms. Now you made an interesting comment about a mealworm, and that is if you start feeding them too small, the end of the tail looks like a mealworm. So if you have a number of different dragons and they're in the cage together, they're going to snap off the end of the tail of their buddy if he thinks it's a mealworm.
The little babies, these guys feed by sight and movement.
Yeah.
They actually see a movement. If you were to just lay a cricket in the cage and he was still, that dragon would be very hard pressed to find that cricket. So they're a sight feeder.
Yeah.
They feed upon sight.
He starts looking at it and he turns his head, and then boom, out goes the tongue and in goes the cricket.
Yeah. Now you throw a cup full of crickets in there and they go everywhere. Then you got all this movement and they just it's a feeding frenzy, basically. Right. But it's the same way with what you were talking about when you were talking about this tail. Baby bearded dragons are basically looking for movement, and if they see movement, if their buddy's sitting next to them, and if you start them off on mealworms too early, they'll see the tail and they won't differentiate. If that tail moves, they'll think it's a mealworm. Then it's too late. They've just
taken off the tail.
The tip of the tail. So
okay.
Mealworms, 6 weeks older. That's where we start.
That's where you start. So start feeding mealworms at 6 or above, 6 weeks or above. All right. Let's talk about the superworm. When would you start introducing a superworm to a bearded dragon?
Superworms, 3 months. Basically, now there's small. You can get smaller superworms now in the market. People are growing. They have a small, medium, and large version of the superworm. Same as the mealworms. If you use the small superworms, you can go ahead and start feeding them at 6 weeks. Kind of the same thing. You can't really judge a superworm because if you would fold him in half, basically, then put him between the dragon's eyes, you might get a better idea of how big to feed your superworms.
Oh, really?
Smaller is better, okay, with anything with these guys, especially when they're babies. So yes.
No, but as like this one here, he can eat full-grown superworms, no problem, and he does eat plenty.
He'll eat. If you just keep giving them to him. I've had dragons this size sit there and eat 20 of them at a time without batting an eye.
Yeah, he'll do it. Gone. There's a lot of people who call me up and they say, well, can't the superworm eat his way through the stomach of the bearded dragon?
Never had that happen.
I hear this all the time.
A superworm will die, basically, if he is chomped one time. Basically, if he chews that superworm one time, I've had dragons cut him in half basically, and that the rest of the superworm is just
Gone.
gone.
Well, then is it the giant mealworm?
Giant mealworm that
Can eat through the stomach? Or are there any of these worms? It's out there
not
on
that-
the internet,
not
all
that
over.
not that we've experienced it
Okay,
to this time.
so based on Robert Johnson, who is a well-known bearded dragon breeder, has thousands and thousands of these things, you have never seen a case
Never seen
where
it
a
taste.
worm has eaten through the stomach.
No.
Okay, so that should help you make your decision on it. So the superworm versus the giant mealworm.
It's just just like potatoes and beans. It's just a different diet.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
Nutrition-wise,
now,
or-
mealworms, it depends on the hormones and all, and the steroids used to produce the giant mealworms.
Yeah, that's how a giant mealworm is made.
Yes.
I mean, and that's why we don't sell a lot of them. But it's just basically a medium mealworm that they feed hormones to.
Exactly.
And through that hormone, they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So they're about the same size as
As
a
a superworm.
superworm, but they have hormones in addition. So I'm not too thrilled. I wouldn't feed him the giant mealworm, but there's some people that love him. So,
We don't use any giant mealworms in our breeding
Right.
facility.
okay.
We-
Waxworm. Let's talk about waxworm.
Waxworms is kind of like a candy for these guys. High in fat.
Right.
If you got a dragon that's getting skinny around the base of the tail where they store their fat,
Right.
you can start them on a good diet of waxworms. Just give it to them as a treat, say with their normal diet.
Right.
They'll start fattening up here on the base of the tail.
Mhm.
And as for a staple, waxworms, no. But as a treat,
There's too
or-
much fat in the
right,
waxworm.
as a treat, or if you want to try to get your dragon back up to his normal weight, like a gravid female,
Mhm.
you need to be dosing her with calcium.
And for everybody, what does gravid mean?
That means she's with eggs.
With eggs. And so what the process of making eggs is going to take a lot out of her body,
It's
right?
gonna take a lot of out of body.
Right.
She'll pull from her own calcium reserves. We supplement our gravid females every day with calcium with D3.
Right.
They get a variety of waxworms and hornworms, the tobacco or tomato worm.
Okay, so what about the phoenix worms? We have a lot of people, a lot of you guys buy phoenix worms out there. What do you like about the phoenix worm?
Phoenix worm is a great source for baby bearded dragons.
Now, he eats a lot of phoenix worms.
Yes, he'll take a lot of phoenix worms to feed this guy. Baby bearded dragons.
As a supplement, though.
As a supplement.
Yeah, feed him as a supplement.
Phoenix worms for your babies, though, is pretty much the best thing going as far as the babies that have fell behind the other group. We'll have 10 to 15 babies in a bin in our breeding facility, and they'll always be the babies that fall behind. The more aggressive babies will get most of the food, and then the babies that fall behind. We use phoenix worms to bring these smaller babies back up to size.
And you actually see it happen.
Oh yeah, definitely.
No question about it.
No question about
Okay.
it. You might have to isolate them and feed them the phoenix worms.
Right.
Because the other dragons will try to get the phoenix worms too.
First.
So we have what we call a misfit bunch. And the misfit bunch are the dragons that have been left behind. And we take phoenix worms and we feed them to them individually, right in front of their face. They'll get them, once they learn what they are, it's like candy to them.
So the phoenix worm is kind of like, nutrition-wise, it's one of the best all-around worms out there. Now, the only problem with the phoenix worm is there's not a lot of food to it. It's a small worm,
Right.
right?
That's when we basically just use it for our
Just for
babies.
that, okay. So for what you're doing, it might be too expensive. But for the general person out there, you got one bearded dragon, a cup of phoenix worms is a good investment.
Oh, definitely.
That's what I have for him.
For a pet,
Right.
single dragon, couple lasts you a good while.
Okay, and the last worm is the butterworm. So let's talk about the butterworm. Do you ever use butterworms?
Upon rare occasion, we use butterworms, just for
Okay.
variety of diet.
Just for variety. I don't think Robert gets them too often, but we sell a lot of butterworms, and it's mostly because they have calcium in it, and they actually do have a higher fat content. So you sort of combining the two together, it's just another good treat. And they
Kind of like waxworms.
kind of like waxworms. They do come from Chile. They're imported in, and they're irradiated so they can't reproduce. But it's a nice treat.
Didn't know that.
See, we're all learning from each other here. All right, Allison, can you turn it off, please?